Hello, my dear listeners. I'm so happy to see you again this evening. Tonight, I'm back with another story about a historical figure. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel. Today's story is titled The Gentle Rise of John D. Rockefeller. Chapter 1. The Boy from Richford Once. Upon a quiet spring morning in the peaceful village of Richford, New York, a child was born who would one day reshape the world, not with noise or pride, but with focus, discipline, and a whispering kind of ambition. His name was John Davison Rockefeller, and he came into the world on July 8, 1839, wrapped in a homemade blanket, cradled by the soft arms of his mother, Eliza. The tiny wooden house smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread, and outside, the hills rolled gently like someone had tucked the land beneath a soft green quilt. Eliza held her baby close. She was a deeply religious woman, calm, measured, and quiet. She believed in hard work, prayer, and thrift. John would grow up listening to the gentle rhythm of her footsteps and the soothing hum of hymns she sang while tending to her chores. She was the first teacher of his character, the calm compass that helped him navigate a world full of uncertainty. John's father, William Big Bill Rockefeller, was a different sort of man, tall, broad, and endlessly on the move. Bill had the gift of persuasion and a mischievous spark in his eye. He sold elixirs and potions, traveling for weeks at a time, calling himself a botanic physician. To some, he was a charmer, to others, a swindler. But to young John, he was simply a mystery someone who came and went, carrying stories, promises, and sometimes disappointments. Though the Rockefeller home was often short on money, it was rich in lessons. Eliza taught her children the value of saving, of giving to the church, of honesty in all things. Willful waste makes woeful want, she would say, with a patient smile. She gave John a single penny for candy and watched how carefully he would think before spending it. Even at the age of 5, he didn't like waste. He liked order. He liked counting. As John grew older, the family moved often first to Moravia and later to Oviedo, all small towns surrounded by green hills and quiet rivers. At each place, he watched his mother sew clothes by hand, make soap in an iron pot, and feed her children with food grown in their garden. She was never idle, and slowly, John absorbed that quiet diligence into his bones. At school, John wasn't the loudest boy, nor the most charismatic, but he was steady. When the teacher asked a question, John thought before he spoke. He liked arithmetic, especially when it came with ledgers and columns. He could sit for hours adding numbers and balancing books, while other boys roughhoused outside. His classmates called him the deacon because he acted so serious and proper. He didn't mind. He preferred calm to chaos. He preferred certainty to surprise. When John was 12 years old, he made a decision that would stay with him for life. He would keep track of every penny he earned or spent. So he found an empty notebook and labeled it, ledger, a dot, inside, in tidy handwriting. He wrote his first entry, September 26th, lent to a neighbor, 50 cents. It wasn't just money to him, it was a way to make sense of the world. Every page in that book was like a candle, glowing in the dark, lighting a path toward something clearer, something purposeful. In Cleveland, Ohio, the family finally settled for a longer stretch. It was a growing city with muddy streets, clattering wagons, and a rising sense of possibility. Young John, now in his mid-teens, looked around and saw more than houses and shops. He saw a future. He walked into a local office with a firm voice and asked for a job. "What can you do?" The man asked. "I can work hard. I can be trusted," John replied. And so he was hired as an assistant bookkeeper, earning 50 cents a day each morning. He arrived early, hair combed, boots polished, eyes focused. He sat at a high desk, carefully copying numbers from bills into ledgers. While others chatted or daydreamed, John counted, calculated, and learned. The oil business had not yet come, but the seeds of discipline, prudence, and calm persistence were being planted deeply in John's soul. He saved most of his wages. He gave some to the church, and at night he would sit under the glow of a small oil lamp, writing in Ledger B. There was one entry that stayed with him. First earned $50, gave $5 to church. It was a rule he set for himself. Give back before you take more. As the years passed, his skills grew, and so did his confidence. He learned to make deals not loudly, but with calm clarity. He respected order, efficiency, and honesty. He believed in watching every drop, whether it was oil or ink. And though he was still just a young man in a busy city, he began to dream of something more, an enterprise that would be built with care, run with integrity, and guided by steady hands. The boy from Richford, who once sold turkeys and counted pennies, was beginning to glimpse the path of a future tycoon. But for now, the night had grown soft, and the moonlight danced through the window. In a small boarding room above a busy street, John D. Rockefeller closed his ledger and blew out the lamp. Another day of work awaited, but for now he would rest and dream. Chapter 2: Counting Pennies and Chasing Dreams. The streets of Cleveland whispered with horse hooves and the clink of blacksmiths' hammers. It was a young, growing city on the edge of America's restless ambition, and within it, a quiet, young man was beginning to build something stronger than brick and deeper than wealthy, was building habits. John D. Rockefeller, now just 16 years old, continued his work as a clerk and bookkeeper. Every morning before sunrise, he smoothed his collar, tied his shoes carefully, and walked with even steps to his desk. There, among stacks of ledgers and ink bottles, he began each day with a mind as calm as the still surface of a lake. His work was not exciting to others, calculating freight costs, recording payments, balancing columns, but to John, it was beautiful in its precision. Every cent had a purpose. Every line told a story. He believed that money was not for spending. It was for shaping. At the end of each workday, he didn't waste his earnings on treats or fine clothes. Instead, he saved, and then saved more. Save when you can, he once wrote, and not when you have to. He believed money should work harder than the man who earned it. John wasn't alone in his journey. He had a friend, Morris Clark, who shared his vision for the future. They would talk during lunch breaks, imagining a business of their own, something honest, something big. And in 1859, when John was just 20 years old, that dream turned real. He and Morris scraped together their savings. John's portion was $1,000. Saved over 4 careful years, and opened a small company, Clark and Rockefeller, their business, trading grains, meats, and produce, helping connect farmers with buyers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steady was John's favorite speed. Every transaction was recorded. Every partner was paid fairly. John's reputation for honesty grew. Even older merchants began to trust his quiet demeanor, his dependable calculations, and his calm presence during tense negotiations. He became known for never raising his voice. Even under pressure, you can do anything through calm persistence, he once told a younger clerk. Storms will pass. You stay steady. But something new was bubbling beneath the soil of Pennsylvania, just a few hundred miles away. Something black, something sticky, something that would change everything. It was oil. At first, people didn't know what to make of it. It stained clothes, it smelled strange, but it burned bright and long in lamps. And soon, investors rushed in, drilling, pumping, and spilling fortunes. It was a gold rush, but darker and slipperier. John D. Rockefeller watched quietly. He saw the chaos, the waste, the speculation, the fires, the bankruptcies. He didn't rush in like the others. He studied, he measured, he waited. And then, when he understood enough, he made his move. In 1863, he and Morris Clark invested in a small refinery, a place where crude oil was turned into usable kerosene for lamps. The world was still lit by flame, and kerosene burned brighter and cleaner than whale oil. John wasn't interested in digging wells. He didn't want to drill into the ground. He wanted to bring order to the madness. He wanted to refine the oil, clean it, purify it, and distribute it with care. He brought his ledgers, he brought his steady mind, and slowly his refinery began to run smoother than the others. Where others wasted oil, John saved it. Where others guessed prices, John calculated. Where others panicked, John remained calm. Success, he whispered to himself one evening, comes from doing common things uncommonly well. But partnership wasn't always easy. Morris Clark, bold and risk-loving, wanted to expand faster. John, cautious and steady, wanted control. In 1865, after disagreements and tension, John offered to buy Morris out. At a quiet auction between them, John made a final bid, $72,500. It was a bold move, nearly all his savings and borrowed money, but he believed in his vision. And with that bid, he became the sole owner of the refinery. He renamed it Rockefeller and Andrews. From that moment on, John D. Rockefeller became not just a businessman, but a strategist. He began building something entirely new, an oil company that didn't just chase profit, but created efficiency, reduced waste, and offered a product so clean and cheap that people all across America would light their homes with it. He was still young, barely 30, but every night he opened his ledger, lit a small lamp, and recorded the day's entries. He still gave to the church. He still saved, and he still believed that calm persistence would win in the end. The trains rumbled in the distance. Ships lined the shores of the Great Lakes, and somewhere inside a tidy office in Cleveland, a man with quiet eyes and still hands looked out the window, not at the chaos of the oil rush, but at the shape of something coming together. He saw not just barrels and buyers. He saw an empire of refinement, but the night was growing late. The books were balanced. The lamp flickered. John placed his pen down and folded his hands. Another day of order, another step forward. Tomorrow, the real expansion would begin. Chapter 3. A man of ledgers and purpose. Outside the windows of Cleveland, the air buzzed with the sound of progress. Trains clattered across new tracks. Ships drifted across the lake. and barrels rolled along muddy roads, each one filled with the dark, glistening promise of oil. Inside a modest office, John D. Rockefeller sat at his desk, pen in hand, ledger open, posture straight. The oil boom had begun sweeping the country into a frenzy, but Rockefeller remained grounded, his thoughts as calm as the quiet ticking of his wall clock. He was not dazzled by wealth. He was not tempted by reckless expansion. He believed in something far more enduring than luck or bursts of fortune. He believed in discipline. Now the sole owner of his refinery, Rockefeller turned his attention to efficiency. Every part of the business had to be optimized. No waste, no excess, no confusion. Let the others speculate, he told his colleagues gently. We will build something that lasts. He examined every barrel. He calculated every shipment. He noticed, for instance, that iron barrels leaked more often, so he had stronger barrels built. He discovered he could save thousands by reusing waste gases from the refining process. He even found a use for the byproducts. Others threw away selling paraffin wax and lubricants as extra profit streams. It was, to Rockefeller, a kind of art. The art of perfecting the ordinary. His workers respected him, though few really understood him. He spoke softly, often walked alone, and spent long hours in quiet thought. He didn't shout orders or demand attention. He simply made decisions, measured and sure, like stones being laid on a path. And as the weeks became months, and the months turned to years, John's refinery outpaced all the rest. He didn't just refine oil, he refined business. One day, he gathered a few trusted partners. Henry Flagler, among the men, spoke clearly but gently. There is no reason for so much waste in this industry. We can build something that brings orthodox the country. And so, in 1870, they formed a new company, the Standard Oil Company. It wasn't just a business, it was a vision of stability in an industry full of risk, a vision of affordable lighting for every home, a vision of excellence in every barrel. John D. Rockefeller wasn't interested in being rich. He was interested in being reliable. He set prices low so that even the poorest families could afford kerosene. He negotiated shipping rates that helped keep costs down. He built trust with railroads, with banks, with suppliers. And slowly, Standard Oil became known across America, not as the flashiest company, but as the strongest. But with growth came whispers. Other oil men, who couldn't match Rockefeller's efficiency, began to grumble. They accused him of playing too quietly, too cleverly. They didn't see his long nights in the office, his obsessive attention to detail. They didn't see the sacrifices behind the success. They only saw barrels moving faster than theirs, ships docking at ports before theirs, profits rising steadily, without noise. Still, John did not answer them. He believed the work would speak for itself. His philosophy was simple: control the refining process, reduce waste at every step, offer a fair price that the market could depend on, grow quietly, steadily, and permanently. In his personal life, John was no different. He lived in a modest house, drove a used buggy, and wore plain black suits. Though wealth was flowing to him like rivers to the sea, he avoided extravagance. His wife, Laura, shared his values: simple meals, strong morals, and deep faith. He was home every night for dinner. He prayed before every meal, and every Sunday He taught Sunday school, reading scripture in the same calm voice he used at the office. Gave generously to the church, and even more quietly, he began giving to causes that helped others: schools, orphanages, and hospitals. He didn't seek recognition, he just felt it was the right thing to do. Back at Standard Oil, things were changing rapidly. John began acquiring other refineries, dozens of them, then hundreds. But he didn't buy to dominate. He bought to organize, to bring order to chaos. When he acquired a refinery, he improved. It sometimes kept the managers, sometimes offered them jobs. He believed every person had a place if they were willing to work with care. Some called him a monopolist, but to John, he was simply removing waste, reducing risk, and ensuring that Americans could rely on their lamps to light at night, every single night. At the close of each day, long after others had gone home, Rockefeller would return to his books. He would open a new page in his ledger and write, in neat ink, barrels shipped today, 3,420 kerosene, sold at 4 cents per gallon, costs reduced by 0.2%, and then he would sit back, fold his hands, and whisper to himself, "We are building something eternal, not just in oil, but in trust." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the city of Cleveland slowed into evening. Inside, a single oil lamp flickered warmly over the quiet desk of a man whose fortune was growing not through luck or noise, but through the soft, steady rhythm of purpose. Chapter 4. The Birth of Standard Oil's Empire's dawn spread its light over the rooftops of Cleveland. The chimneys of Standard Oil puffed quietly into the sky. Workers stirred, barrels rolled, and railroad whistles sang their morning tune. It was another day in the calm and calculated world of John D. Rockefeller, where even the sunrise felt deliberate. Inside his office, John sat in quiet prayer before beginning his day. He believed that what he did mattered not just in business, but in how it affected people, communities, and futures. Though he was not a man of many words, he was always clear. Efficiency, honesty, and service, these are our foundations. It was now the early 1870s, and the name Standard Oil was beginning to ripple far beyond Cleveland. Rockefeller's company refined over 25% of all American oil land. That number was rising fast. He expanded thoughtfully, city by city, always with the same pattern. Investigate each refinery. Was it wasteful or efficient? Offer to buy it not at a bargain, but at a fair price. Improve it using standards, systems, and standards. He didn't shout about his success. He didn't celebrate with champagne or gold. Instead, he marked progress in ledgers and quiet walks. He called it the most perfect example of industrial organization the world has ever seen. Others called it something else, a monopoly. As Standard Oil grew, so did the scrutiny. Competitors who couldn't match Rockefeller's low prices began to spread rumors. He's too powerful, they said. He's buying everything. But John didn't respond with anger. He responded with order. He created what would later be known as the Standard Oil group of companies united under one guiding purpose, working together to refine oil more efficiently, more cleanly, and more dependably than ever before. And slowly, almost silently, Standard Oil came to control over 90% of oil refining in the United States. But this empire did not gleam with excess or noise. It was quiet. It was methodical. It was built not by chance, but by millions of measured decisions. Rockefeller insisted on keeping his operations clean, both physically and ethically. His refineries were swept daily. His books were checked and double-checked. His employees were expected to act with respect and dignity. He believed in hard work, but also in rest and reflection. He took long walks in nature. He listened to the quiet rustle of trees. He trusted in rhythms, both natural and industrial. He once said, "Do not many of us who fail to achieve big things fail because we lack concentration, the art of concentrating the mind on the thing to be done at the proper time and to the exclusion of everything else." Meanwhile, oil was changing the world. It lit homes, it powered ships, it fueled the early engines of the industrial age. And at the center of it all, John D. Rockefeller stayed largely in the shadows, letting others chase the spotlight while he refined his methods. He built pipelines to carry oil without interruption. He created tank cars to move oil more safely by rail. He trained young managers to think long-term, not for profit today, but stability tomorrow. When questioned by the press, he gave quiet, brief answers. When praised, he shifted attention to his team. He didn't believe in personal glory. He believed in quiet legacy. Yet not everyone appreciated the silence of his empire. Reporters, politicians, and rival businessmen accused Standard Oil of being too secretive, too controlling. They wrote angry headlines and demanded investigations, but John remained still. "We are not hiding," he would say softly. "We are organizing." And still, he gave each year more of his fortune was sent to churches, schools, and charities. He believed that wealth came with duty, and that giving should be done quietly, not with fanfare. His belief was simple. God gave me my money, and so he would use it for good. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil was no longer just a company, it was a system, with offices in every major city, tankers on every river, and kerosene lighting homes from New York to Kansas. It became part of daily life. Still, John's habits never changed. He awoke early. He read scripture. He opened his ledgers. He greeted his staff with a nod and a smile. He once told a young employee, "Always do right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest." As the sun set on another day of quiet expansion, Rockefeller sat in his office, looking over a small map pinned to the wall. It showed the rail lines, the pipelines, the port's end. He felt responsibility. He folded his hands and whispered a prayer not for more, but for wisdom to use what he already had wisely outside. The city lights flickered, on many powered by the oil that flowed through pipes, barrels, and refineries. Touched by his hand, inside, the flame of his own lamp danced in the still air. He closed his eyes for a moment. The empire he'd built was strong, but his greatest work, he believed, was still ahead. Chapter 5. A world lit by kerosene. The night sky over America was changing. Where once streets were lit by gaslight, or not lit at all, a new warmth began to glow in windows, one by one soft flames flickering in kerosene lamps, pushing back the darkness. Children read by it. Families dined beside it. Storefronts gleamed with it. And behind that gentle light stood the quiet force of John D. Rockefeller. He didn't invent kerosene. He didn't drill the oil wells himself, but he had refined the process, brought order to the industry. And most of all, he had made kerosene so affordable, so dependable, that it reached not just cities, but villages, farms, and cabins deep. In the countryside, in the still hours of the morning, Rockefeller would walk the floor of his office or his refinery, his hands behind his back, his mind already turning like gears. He spoke little, but he observed everything: the way barrels were loaded, the speed of the workers' movements, the precision of the shipping schedules. And when something was wrong, he didn't scold. He simply asked, "How can this be done better?" This was his true obsession, not profit, but perfection. By the 1880s, kerosene had become the lifeblood of American evenings. Whale oil had all but disappeared. Gaslight was expensive and limited, but Standard Oil kerosene was cheap, clean, and available everywhere. People didn't often know the name Rockefeller. They knew only that their lamps worked, that their fuel cost little, that their nights were no longer so dark. And yet, in this success, John remained humble. His clothes were still plain. His home, while now larger, was quiet. His family life, filled with love, was rooted in routine and prayer. He walked to church. He ate simple meals. He still taught Sunday school, even when newspapers called him the richest man in America. But shadows were forming on the edges of that glowing world. Competitors were growing frustrated. Reporters grew curious. Politicians began to listen. How could one company control so much? They asked. They didn't understand that it wasn't force that built Standard Oil, it was focus. While others rushed, Rockefeller waited. While others gambled, he calculated. While others shouted, he listened to him. Leadership was serving others more wisely than they could serve themselves. And when small refiners complained of being bought out or underpriced, Rockefeller responded not with anger, but with offers. Join us, improve with us, or sell to us and find peace. To him, it wasn't conquest, it was consolidation. In those days, Standard Oil was not just a company, it was a machine of trust, working quietly behind the scenes. It had pipelines running underground across state lines. It had railway cars customized to carry kerosene safely and efficiently. It had warehouses in every major port, and still it grew. In foreign lands, China, India, South America's small tin cans, stamped Standard Oil, arrived in crates. Even in the farthest corners of the earth, the lamps began to glow. Rockefeller was now lighting not just cities, but the world. He never traveled overseas, but his influence did, carried in barrels and boxes, in tiny flames burning on faraway tables. At home, however, the public mood was changing. The word monopoly appeared more often in newspapers. Investigative journalists began to dig. One, Ida Tarbell, whose own father had lost a business in the oil wars, began writing a series of articles that would become famous. The history of the Standard Oil Company. She accused Rockefeller of being secretive, ruthless, and overly powerful. And though John had done nothing illegal, he had never bribed, never stolen, never forced. He had out-organized everyone. And in the public's eyes, that alone made him suspicious. Still, Rockefeller did not lash out. He didn't write to newspapers. He didn't make public appearances. He simply stayed quiet and kept working at night. After long days managing one of the world's largest enterprises, he would sit in his study, a fire glowing in the hearth, reading scripture, or listening to his children talk about their school lessons. He would sip tea, he would pray, he would write in his journals, and always he would remind himself, to whom much is given, much is required. He began to think more deeply about giving, how to do it not only generously but wisely, how to apply the same focus and discipline he brought to oil, to philanthropy. But that was a path for another chapter. For now, Standard Oil lit the world, and Rockefeller, seated in stillness, watched its gentle glow spread far beyond anything he had ever imagined. As a boy in Richford, he had turned oil into light, disorder into structure, chance into strategy. And now, as the stars blinked above his house in Forest Hill, John D. Rockefeller closed his eyes and whispered a quiet thanks for the day, for the work, for the ability to serve others, even if they never knew his name. Chapter 6. Firestorms and Backlash. The world John D. Rockefeller had built glowed with lamplight, steady and golden. Across continents, small flames flickered in windows, shops, and alleyways, one touched, in some quiet way, by Standard Oil. And yet, the brighter the glow, the longer the shadows that followed. By the 1890s, John's empire had become so large, so efficient, so deeply rooted in the veins of American industry, that many began to question how much power one man or one company should have. What began as whispers turned to roars. Newspapers that once praised Standard Oil's reliability now published articles with fiery titles. The octopus of industry too big for democracy. Is this the end of competition? And at the heart of those headlines stood the same man who still rose early, read scripture, and drank his tea from the same chipped mug as always, John D. Rockefeller. He wasn't flashy, he didn't give grand speeches, but he was being drawn into a very public storm. One of the most powerful voices against him came from a determined journalist named Ida Tarbell. She began publishing a detailed series about the growth of Standard Oil, its methods, and what she saw as unfair advantages. She did her homework. She interviewed former employees. She studied court records and shipping contracts. And over time, her writing painted Rockefeller not as a quiet reformer, but as a cold, calculating monopolist. She wrote, "Mr. Rockefeller has systematically played with loaded dice. His success has been won not by honest enterprise, but by ruthless tactics." It hurt John not because she misunderstood his numbers, but because she misunderstood his heart. He never saw himself as ruthless. He saw himself as disciplined. He didn't crush competitors. He believed he saved them from their own inefficiency. He didn't steal customers. He earned them by offering better service, lower prices, and steady supply. Still, the public mood was shifting. In the government halls of Washington, D.C., a new word began to echo: antitrust. The Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890, gave the federal government the power to investigate and dissolve monopolies. Though Rockefeller had always operated within the law, his company had grown too dominant for comfort. People feared that when one firm controlled an industry even gently, it could control everything: prices, wages, even progress itself. And so, the U.S. government filed a lawsuit to break up Standard Oil. It was not a personal attack. It was a test of power, industry versus democracy. John, already nearing retirement, didn't fight with anger. He didn't rage in courtrooms or summon reporters to defend his name. Instead, he trusted in time. He believed that history, when written fairly, would see not a tyrant, but a man who brought light, safety, and structure to a wild and wasteful industry. And even if the courts ruled against him, he whispered one truth to himself: you can destroy a company, but you cannot destroy discipline. In 1911, after many long years of legal battles, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil must be broken up into 34 smaller companies. It was the end of the single empire. But strangely, it was also the beginning of a fortune even larger. Those 34 companies, each with parts of Standard's infrastructure, grew quickly. Names like Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Amoco would later emerge from the rubble, giants in their own right, and John, now in his 70s, watched it unfold with calm detachment. The empire he had built had scattered, but the principles he had lived by remained intact: efficiency, integrity, long-term thinking, giving back more than he took. In the public eye, he was still a mystery. To some, he was a villain. To others, a genius. Too many, simply a man of too much money and too few words. But those who knew him personally, his wife, Laura, his children, his church friends, saw the quiet beneath the storm. They knew how deeply he believed that money was a tool, not a prize. They saw how he read Ida Tarbell's articles without malice, only reflection. And they knew that while the world called him the richest man on earth, he still bowed his head in prayer, like a farm boy from Richford. And as the public debated and the markets shifted, John D. Rockefeller turned more fully toward a new mission: philanthropy. He had spent his youth building one empire. Now he would spend his elder years dismantling another: ignorance, disease, and poverty. But that would come in time. For now, as the wind rolled gently through the trees around his country estate and the stars blinked silently above, he closed the windows, dimmed the lamp, and said a quiet prayer, not for wealth, not for power, but for peace. He had faced the firestorms. He had borne the backlash. And through it all, he had stayed steady, just as he always had. Chapter 7. The breakup that built a legacy. The year was 1911, and the courtroom doors had closed behind the final ruling. Standard Oil would be broken apart. To some, it was a day of justice. To others, a day of loss. But to John D. Rockefeller, now in his early 70s, it was a day of transition. He had spent a lifetime bringing order to chaos, building an empire that lit the world. And now, that empire, carefully, quietly, brilliantly built, was being disassembled. But as always, John didn't panic. He didn't argue. He didn't mourn. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said softly to his son, "It is done. Let us move forward." The courts had divided Standard Oil into 34 smaller companies, each given a share of its pipelines, rail contracts, refineries, and market presence. The public expected the empire's value to collapse, but something strange happened. Each of those companies, well-trained, well-organized, and still driven by the same principles John had built into their foundation, thrived. Their shares rose. Their profits climbed. And John, who had retained stock in each one, saw his personal fortune multiply. The breakup had ended Standard Oil's dominance, but it had created a network of success built upon the very structure Rockefeller had once drawn in quiet rooms by Lamplight. It was, in a quiet way, a kind of rebirth, now freed from the daily responsibilities of business. John D. Rockefeller turned fully to something he had long prepared for, giving away his fortune, not in grand gestures or noisy press events, but in systems, just like Standard Oil. If it is a duty to acquire wealth, he said, then it is a much nobler duty to administer it for the good of the community. He began by establishing the Rockefeller Foundation, an organization meant not to give gifts, but to solve problems at their root. Its first missions were clear and ambitious: end hookworm disease in the American South, improve public health systems around the world, fund education, particularly for African American schools in rural areas, and eventually to support medical research that would change human life. He did not want his name in lights. In fact, many of the schools and hospitals that benefited from his donations never knew who funded them. He believed deeply in anonymous giving, the kind that came not from pride, but from peace. John gave more than $500 million in his lifetime, more than any individual in human history up to that point. But even then, he lived modestly. He woke early. He walked through his gardens. He wrote letters, played with his grandchildren, and enjoyed the soft rustle of trees outside his home in Pocantico Hills, New York. He laughed more in those years. He sang hymns with more ease. He had done his building end. Now he was learning how to let go. One of his greatest joys was the creation of the University of Chicago, which he funded quietly but deeply. From a quiet vision, it became one of the most respected institutions in the country, an example, again, of how careful planning and generous purpose could shape the world. He also funded Spelman College, named after his wife Laura's family, to educate African American women at a time when few believed in such missions. And when scientific discovery became a new frontier, he supported the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which would later contribute to breakthroughs in vaccines, treatments, and public health for generations to come. All the while, the public image of Rockefeller began to change. He had once been seen as the silent shadow behind an empire. But now, photographs showed an old man in a straw hat, handing out dimes to children and strangers. With a smile and a laugh, it became a curious tradition. John D. Rockefeller, the wealthiest man alive, handing out shiny 10-cent coins, saying, "Save it, invest it, give some away." People asked if it was eccentricity, but to John, it was a lesson in seed planting. He had once saved pennies as a child. Now, he hoped others would too. His health grew fragile with age, but his spirit remained light. He took joy in birdsong, in Sunday hymns, and in reading from his well-worn Bible. When asked what he considered his greatest success, he didn't mention oil. He said quietly, "Being able to sleep peacefully at night, knowing that I have tried to do good." As the companies he once led continued to thrive under new names, and as hospitals and schools flourished in his foundation's shadow, John watched the world from the porch of his home. In the gentle golden light of the setting sun, he had built an empire. Then he had released it, and in doing so, he had built something far greater. Chapter 8. The Quiet Billionaire. The world called him the richest man alive. Some called him the most powerful. Others still remembered the shadow of Standard Oil and whispered his name like a myth. But John D. Rockefeller, now well into his 80s, lived not in marble halls or bustling towers, but in a home surrounded by trees and birdsong in Pocantico Hills, New York. His empire had stretched across continents, but in his final decades, his life shrunk delightfully inward. Each day began the same way. He woke early always, early and thanked God for the breath in his lungs, the health in his bones, and the peace in his soul. He took long, careful walks through the paths of his garden, wearing his wide-brimmed straw hat, nodding to every gardener, every stable hand, every neighbor. He moved slowly, but with purpose, just as he always had. His days were simple. He read, he wrote letters, he reviewed donations being made through the Rockefeller Foundation, and he spent time with his grandchildren, telling them stories about hard work, about saving pennies, about discipline and gratitude. He still clipped coupons from newspapers, still balanced small ledgers by hand, still handed out shiny dimes to children and strangers, with a smile that carried no judgment, just hope. Save it, he'd whisper, and add to it, make it grow. People were surprised. Why would a billionaire be so fascinated with such a small coin? But to John, the dime was a symbol, a quiet reminder that great things, fortunes, dreams begin with something small, something earned and never wasted. Though his name appeared in newspapers and libraries around the world, John didn't care much for recognition. When asked how he wished to be remembered, he said, as a man who tried to live his life according to the teachings of Jesus Christ. He gave generously, but always with structure. He didn't believe in handouts. He believed in empowerment. And so, his foundation focused not only on charity, but on science, education, public health, and agriculture tools that helped people build better lives for themselves. He often said, the best philanthropy is not just giving money, but giving help where help will do the most good. At home, his staff adored him. He was never harsh, never loud. If he disapproved of something, he said so gently. If he saw someone working hard, he'd pat their shoulder, offer a kind word, or leave a note of thanks. In the evenings, he listened to music. He had grown fond of simple melodies, hymns, string quartets, quiet piano. The house would fill with soft sound, while John sat by the window, hands folded, eyes distant. He never chased noise. He chased clarity. He wrote often in his journals, reflecting on life with simple phrases. I always tried to turn every disaster into an opportunity. Singleness of purpose is one of the chief essentials of success in life. I had no ambition to make a fortune. Mere money-making has never been my goal. I wanted to live a useful life. Despite his age, his mind remained sharp. He asked questions, challenged ideas, read deeply. He was especially fascinated by medicine, how it could prevent suffering, not just treat it. Much of his later philanthropy funded research that would one day lead to vaccines, public sanitation systems, and hospital reform in quiet ways. John D. Rockefeller was still changing the world, not through oil, but through healing. And yet the world itself was changing too. New technologies were emerging: automobiles, electricity, telephones. Oil was no longer just for lamps, it was fueling engines, planes, and war machines. Rockefeller watched it all from a peaceful distance. His part was done. He had planted his seeds. Others would tend the forest now. Occasionally, guests would visit. Writers, scholars, old friends, young admirers. They asked for stories, for advice, for the secret to his success. He always answered the same way, in a calm voice that never hurried. Work hard, save honestly, Give generously, and remember, you can accomplish anything if you do not care. Who gets the credit? He said it kindly, as if offering a blessing, and then he would look out the window at the same trees he had planted decades ago, and smile to himself. As the sun set behind the hills of his estate, the rooms would glow with quiet light. He no longer needed to count barrels or prices or rail cars. His final ledgers were spiritual, not financial, and though the world called him a billionaire, John D. Rockefeller saw himself as a caretaker of money, of people, of a brief moment in history where he had been asked to bring order to chaos, and had done so as best he could, with a steady hand and a faithful heart. He often said, "God gave me my money," and now he had given it back with purpose. Chapter 9. A life remembered by the time the calendar turned to the summer of 1937. The world was changing faster than ever before. The sky, once crossed by horse-drawn wagons and steamships, now echoed with airplanes. The cities glowed not just from kerosene lamps, but from electric lights stretching far beyond what anyone had imagined. The oil Rockefeller, once refined to warm homes, now powered automobiles, ships, and industry. He had not chased this future. He had helped pave the road toward it step by quiet step. And now, as he sat in his large armchair in the hills of New York, breathing slowly, surrounded by birdsong and the laughter of his great-grandchildren, John D. Rockefeller looked out across the fields of time with peace in his heart. He was 97 years old, no longer involved in any company, no longer concerned with earnings or markets. He had passed on his tools long ago to his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and to a generation of leaders shaped by his philosophy of order, discipline, and responsibility. And yet, people still came. They came to learn, to listen, to thank him. Some came as skeptics, others as admirers, but all left with a sense of quiet surprise. For they had expected the giant of industry, and instead met a gentle, almost grandfatherly man, with soft eyes and a laugh like wind through leaves. They asked about his business empire. He spoke instead of sunrises and scripture. They asked about his wealth. He spoke of dimes, gardens, and balance. They asked about power. He spoke of prayer. Rockefeller had never been easy to summarize. To some, he would always be the oil king, the man who tamed a wild market and made a fortune no one had ever seen before. To others, he would remain the face of one man holding too much, but for many, especially in the quiet corners of the world, he was the reason a child could read at night, a sick woman could get medicine, or a school could stay open through winter. His fingerprints were everywhere, not in stone or signatures, but in systems, in opportunity, in quiet transformation. He had once said, "The poorest man I know is the man who has nothing but money," and by that measure, he had died rich in all the ways that mattered. On May 23, 1937, the soft hum of summer filled the trees. The flowers had begun to bloom along the paths he once walked each morning. The world felt still, and in the quiet of his home, surrounded by family, John D. Rockefeller passed away peacefully, his hands folded, his heart full. There was no great crowd, no parade, no spectacle, just a reverent silence. The world had lost a man who had shaped it, not with shouts, but with calm resolve. News of his death spread quickly. Newspapers around the world printed his name in bold, Rockefeller dead at 97, quiet giant of the century, and yet his legacy had already been set in motion, not in his name, but in the actions he left behind. Medical centers that saved millions, universities that taught generations, foundations that quietly changed the course of global health and science. His story didn't end with his last breath. It continued in every flame that burned cleaner, every life saved by medicine, every young mind sharpened by education. In the days that followed, his family walked the gardens he had tended, rereading the notes he had written, remembering the quiet way he lived. No monuments were built, but in homes and hospitals, schools and science labs, people would unknowingly feel the ripple of his touch. And perhaps, somewhere, a child would still receive a shiny dime and be told, save it, make it grow, use it for good. Because John D. Rockefeller didn't just build an oil empire. He built a way of living and giving that would outlast even the longest pipelines. Chapter 10. Good night, Mr. Rockefeller. And so, the long and quiet journey of John D. Rockefeller comes to a gentle close. From a small boy counting pennies, to a thoughtful man guiding an empire, to an old gentleman walking among trees, out dimes and wisdom. He lived not for noise, but for purpose. He gave not for praise, but for peace. And in the end, he left the world not richer in wealth, but richer in possibility. His life reminds us that greatness doesn't need to shout. It can whisper, it can build slowly, it can give quietly, and still change everything. Tonight, as the stars shine above and your room grows still, let his story remind you, even small steps taken with care can lead to a beautiful legacy. And now, dear listeners, thank you so much for spending this peaceful time with me. It means the world that you've joined me on this gentle journey through history. I hope this story brought you comfort, calm, and perhaps a little inspiration before bed. Good night, dear friends. Sleep deeply, dream kindly, and I'll see you again in another story very soon. Until then, rest well and take care. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more soothing bedtime stories. From my heart to yours, good night.